Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Kenny Redpath, and I'm the Events Officer at the Library. It's been a little while since our last webinar, but we are now firmly up and running with what I think is a great lineup of events in the coming months, so I hope you'll be able to join us for those. Indeed, I had a sneaky glance at the bookings for today's event, and we have had over 130 people booked for this afternoon's webinar. So things are still really popular in that Zoom world. Talking about today's webinar, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Katy Turton, who is here to give a talk called Women of the Russian Revolution. Katy has taught history at Queen's University Belfast and the University of the Highlands and Islands. She is a specialist in Russian and Soviet history, with a particular focus on the women's participation in the revolutionary movement. She has published works on the women of Lenin's family, and you may have spotted her last year on Lucy Worsley's documentary series, Royal History's Biggest Fibs, talking about the Russian Revolution. More recently, she has turned to fiction writing and has just published her first novel, Blackbird Song, described, and I quote, the book set against the Russian Revolution of 1905, a prelude to that of 1917. This novel explores the complexity of relationships and motivations that led to acts of rebellion. I had to say that I hadn't heard of the 1905 revolution, so I'm really looking forward to finding out more about this and the rest of that period in history, as well as the newly released book. But before handing over to Katy, can I just say that there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar, so get thinking and just type your questions into the Q&A function, and we will do our very best to get through as many as we can. But for now, over to you, Katy.
Thanks, Kenny, for that kind introduction, and thanks so much for having me for this webinar talking about women in the Russian Revolution. I've got a ton of photographs from the time to share with you, so my beautiful assistant Beth is going to put them up now, and we'll begin our journey from the 1870s right through to 1917. Thank you. So you'll have noticed this photograph, which was the advert on the advert for this event, and I will be coming back to talk about it later on. So and we'll get the full story behind this extraordinary photograph. Okay,
Katy, Katy, sorry, can I ask you to hide your camera?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, don't want any distractions from me. Okay, so, but to start my talk about women of the revolution, naturally enough, I want to start by talking about a man, and the next slide shows who I'm talking about. So this is Alexander Karensky. He was a lawyer by training and a socialist revolutionary. When the Tsar was overthrown in 1917, he was the first Minister of Justice in the provisional government. Later, he became the Premier. When the Bolsheviks seized power, he fled Russia during and went to the United States as an emigre. He spent the rest of his life teaching there and also writing about the revolution. In his memoirs, he said of the February Revolution of 1917, and if we go to the next slide, you can read it along with me. By a determined, united effort, a new authority and the rudiments of a new national structure were set up. I saw new forms of government shaped by men who the day before would have turned in horror from what they did that day with their own hands. They did it because something inexplicable, mysterious, miraculous had happened, that which we are accustomed to call revolution. This something lit up the souls of men with a purifying fire and filled them with love and readiness for boundless self-sacrifice. We forgot everything that was merely personal, all that was a matter of class or caste, and became for the moment simply men, conscious of our common humanity. It was a moment when every man came into touch with what is universal and eternally human. It was most exhilarating to see about me these men so transformed, working together with sublime devotion for the common good. So, what you'll all have noticed, what is striking about this, is the framing of the revolution as entirely masculine. The revolution was universal and eternally human, but still a male-only affair. It is men who are lit by the purifying fire and ready to sacrifice themselves. It is men who find their common humanity and touch the divine, no less. Women were not part of that mysterious miracle. Indeed, they are implicitly rejected by the reference to forgetting the personal, if we accept the notion embedded here that women only occupy a domestic emotional sphere. However, and if we hop to the next slide, in the moment itself, in the days of the February Revolution, one of Karensky's first acts in government was to order the release from exile of the so-called grandmother of the revolution, Catherine Brezhkovskaya. Furthermore, he ordered that she be conveyed with all due honours to Petrograd. So why would Karensky, in the midst of this apparently masculine revolution, summon Brezhkovskaya? Because she, like so many women in the Russian revolutionary movement, had captured the imagination of the nation. Her contributions to the revolution and the price she paid for them could now lend revolutionary gravitas and credibility to the government. So for the next 40 minutes or so, I want to explore the ways in which women participated in the revolutionary movement and highlight some key figures who may now be obscure in history, but were famous in their day. So let's start with Brezhkovskaya then, the grandmother of the revolution. And if we go on to the next slide, you can see her in her youth. So she was a youngster in the 1870s, and seeing Russia and observing the injustices caused by the autocratic regime, she decided to commit herself to revolutionary activity. She left her husband, placed her child in the care of her brother and his wife, and joined the Going to the People movement. Like hundreds of other Russian young people, she thought the peasantry were the key to reforming the autocratic system and putting into place a society based on communality and equality. So she and others went out to live amongst the peasants and foment revolution. Unfortunately, the peasants were deeply suspicious, at best reluctant to engage with these youths, and at worst ready to report them to the police. Scores of youngsters, including Brezhkovskaya, were tried for their crimes of propagandizing amongst the masses and sentenced to long periods of penal servitude or exile. Brezhkovskaya was hard to contain, however, and she escaped from her exile and went abroad. She did a lecture tour around America and won their hearts. Later, she returned to Russia and formed the Socialist Revolutionary Party, of which more later, but was exiled again and remained there until the revolution. The failure of the Going to the People movement encouraged some to take more drastic action, and a number of revolutionaries turned to terrorism, forming Narodnaya Volya, or the People's Will, and their main target was to be the Tsar. His assassins consisted of a group of 7 men and 3 women. They worked together for 18 months, living illegally in flats and setting up fake businesses in various locations and plotting Alexander's demise. They made 8 audacious attempts to assassinate him, but only finally succeeded in March 1881. And we can see the picture of that in the next slide. Yeah, so the bombers threw a bomb at the Tsar's carriage while he was returning from a military review. And this is how it was portrayed in the newspapers in the following days. So who were the women involved in the terrorist group? If we go into the next slide, our first one is Sofia Pirovskaya. Now, she cut her teeth as well in the Going to the People movement, like Brezhkovskaya, but was in fact acquitted at her trial. She went underground to avoid rearrest, but was captured. However, she escaped, and I just want to share the fantastic anecdote of how she did it. She was being transported by train, and one night she and her 2 guards stopped at one station and were set up for the night in a room. One guard went to sleep underneath the window, another guard went to sleep at the door, both obviously trying to prevent her escape. But Sofia waited till they were asleep and noticed, A, that the guards hadn't locked the door, but also that the door opened outwards. So once her guards were asleep, she simply pushed open the door, stepped over her guard, and boarded the next train and disappeared. So this is the point when she joins the people's will, and in the successful assassination attempt on the Tsar, she took bombs to the bomb throwers, she chose where they should be stationed along the Tsar's route, and she was the one who signalled that the assassination attempt should go ahead. She was arrested almost immediately and tried and hanged on 3rd of April. And if we go to the next slide, we can see a famous portrayal of the regicides, the Tsarobitsa, being hanged. You can see that they're wearing that sign on their chests there. The two other women of the group escaped hanging. If we go to the next slide, we'll see one of them, Geisha Gelfman. Her sentence of death was temporarily commuted as she was pregnant. When she gave birth in prison, her child was taken from her and placed in an orphanage rather than in the care of the relatives who had volunteered to take care of it. And she died of complications from the birth. If we go to the next slide, Vera Fedorov, her sentence was commuted to 20 years of imprisonment in the notorious Schlüsselburg fortress, followed by exile, after her mother appealed directly to the Tsar. And this is a pattern we'll see increasingly, that although death was technically the sentence for terrorist acts, women's sentences were often commuted to long prison sentences instead. Now, Vera Fedorov survived her sentence of using her time in prison to campaign for improved conditions for her fellow prisoners. Later, once she was released from exile, she went abroad and joined the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, which we'll come back to as well. So Alexander II's assassination might have been successful, but it pushed his successor Alexander III to pursue more tyrannical policies. Only after his son Nicholas II succeeded him in 1894 did revolutionary activity really revive. Out of the ashes of the movements of the 70s grew the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party and the Socialist Revolutionaries. So the Social Democrats were first and foremost Marxists who believed in the need for a workers' revolution to establish socialism. Also, importantly, they renounced terrorism as a tactic, preferring instead to educate the workers and agitate for revolution. It's important to note that the SDs didn't renounce violence entirely and were known for committing bank robberies to get funds for their party. And they also fully expected there to be an armed uprising to overthrow the Tsar. This is the group, of course, that splits into the Bolsheviks led by Lenin and the Mensheviks led by Martov. Women found lots of roles to play in the Social Democrats. And I want to highlight here that it's useful to understand the movement as something of a cottage industry. Because of the almost complete lack of political and civil rights in Russia, the only place revolutionaries could meet was in private homes and family settings. So what you find then is that revolutionaries often joined the movement with their families or formed families in revolutionary circles. So mothers of teenage or young adult children were often present at secret meetings being held in their homes, or even ran safe houses so that revolutionaries on the run could have a bed for the night. Brothers and sisters who were radicalised at school, or more usually at university, joined the movement together, as did husbands and wives. And in the cases of these couples, before long, they were usually inducting their children into the movement, training them to keep quiet about revolutionary matters, and even using them to smuggle revolutionary literature around the country. So to illustrate this, as I say, this pattern that was repeated across the movement, I want to look at two key revolutionary families. So if we go on to the next slide, here we have the Ulyanov family. This is Lenin's family. You'll see that he's the third son. So in fact, it was his older sister and brother, Anna and Alexander, who were radicalized at university and joined the revolutionary movement. Alexander, in fact, became involved in a plot to assassinate Alexander III, but was captured and hanged before it took place. After his death, it was Anna that went back to the Ulyanov family and told Vladimir and their siblings about the revolutionary movement and how to join. Now, Olga died when she was very young, but Dmitry and Maria continued on in the family tradition, and the whole family worked as a network within the revolutionary movement, conducting correspondence, supporting each other in prison, and so on. Even Lenin's mother, Maria Alexandrovna, was fully aware of her children's activities and tended to live with them, so was always involved in the movement. If we go to the next slide, the leader of the Menshevik has a remarkably similar story. Yuli Martov, here he is, the second son of the family. He was the first to be radicalized, but then he inducted his siblings into the revolutionary movement as well. So Lydia Dan, Sergei, Vladimir, they all were involved with the Mensheviks, organizing and agitating for revolution. My favourite woman character, though, of the Social Democrats is Eva Bridal, and we can see her on the next slide. So she was a real hands-on activist who juggled family life with her politics. She was adept at smuggling revolutionary literature around to then be distributed to workers. And when she was posted to Baku in 1905, she thought nothing of keeping a pistol in her pocket for her own protection. Here she is in her memoirs talking about how she hid pamphlets. And if we go on to the next slide, you can see the full quote. When I had to go alone somewhere or to travel by postcoach, I used to improve my general appearance by stuffing my pockets with sunflower seeds and assuming that could not care less look that goes with them. Sunflower seeds are a favourite Russian snack. Soon I began to use these trips for transporting illegal literature. I tied the leaflets into a kerchief and put the bundle at the bottom of a basket that I had slung over my arm. Over it, I put some brushes, a kettle, a candlestick, any kitchenware that came to hand, and on top of all of it, the inevitable bag with sunflower seeds. Installed in the coach, I cracked the seeds with great gusto, inviting my neighbours to help themselves straight from the basket. I learnt this touch from the mother of my hostess, a woman of about 65 who spent most of her time transporting illegal literature. But she did not mind taking on other work for us, and at one time she deputised for another mother as the owner of the flat in which our secret printing press was lodged. So I think this is a really fascinating little extract here, because on the one hand we see how Eva Bridal played on domesticity and gendered notions that women would only be doing housework and cooking and wouldn't be involved in the revolutionary movement in order to go unnoticed. But also note the presence of these older mothers who are running safe houses, transporting illegal literature, and even housing the secret printing presses on which the literature was made in the first place. Now, Eva Bridal, like many other revolutionaries, was caught eventually. In fact, the Russian secret police were amazingly efficient. But even when she was sent into exile, Eva Bridal carried on her work, taking her children with her. She formed a revolutionary hub, looked after other revolutionaries, and as many other revolutionaries did, plotted how to escape. She successfully did escape, but what I love about her is that the night before she made the escape, she arranged for a sledge ride for her daughters across the snowy tundra so that she could see the stars. So there's a snapshot of the Social Democrats, but another group emerged too, the Socialist Revolutionaries. And this party was born in part out of Brezhkovskaya's efforts. This was a party dedicated to representing the peasants and using their communal lifestyle as the building bricks of a new socialist society. It was the SRs that also continued the terrorist tradition. Half of their organisation were non-violent, but on the other side there was the so-called combat organisation, which planned and carried out terrorist attacks. By this time, the Tsar and his immediate family led extremely cloistered lives for safety purposes. So the SR's targets consisted of other members of the royal family, regional and city governors, ministers of government, chiefs of police, prison governors, army generals, and any other servant of the state whom they perceived to have committed abuses of power. And they would always be tried by, if you like, by this combat organisation and a death sentence proclaimed, which would be handed to the intended victim where possible. One historian estimates that over the last 20 years of the Tsarist regime, around 17,000 people were injured or killed in terrorist attacks. And once again, women were represented amongst them. So if we move on to the next slide, this is a picture of Anastasia Alexeyevna Bitsenko, and she is one of the few real-life characters who appears in my novel. So Bitsenko first became involved in revolutionary activities as a student when she met and then married an SR party member, Mikhail Stepanovich Bitsenko. They worked together as political agitators and organisers, but parted ways when Anastasia went to St. Petersburg to become a terrorist and he stayed in Smolensk. Bitsenko became part of a terrorist group trying to assassinate the Minister of the Interior, von Pleve. but was arrested in late 1904 and exiled to Vologda. Now, like so many of the other terrorist women, she was not to be kept there. She escaped after just 1 month and went abroad to Geneva to catch her breath and regroup. And by the start of 1905, she was back in Russia. This time she went to Saratov. So let me set the scene a little bit. As Kenny said at the start, the first Russian Revolution occurred, in fact, in 1905, and it was a year of mass turmoil, political uprisings, worker rebellions, peasant revolts, and general chaos across the whole country. Now, the Tsar's response was, on the one hand, to make some grudging reforms, but at the same time, he also sent troops across the whole nation to suppress these uprisings violently. General Sakharov led the brutal campaign in Saratov, so Butsenko led a plot to assassinate him. Now, she achieved it by dressing up as a respectable woman, arranging an appointment with the general at his headquarters, and on being taken into his office, handing him his death certificate, his death warrant, and shooting him. She was captured, imprisoned, and sentenced to death, and this was commuted to penal servitude for life. Like Brezhkovskaya, she was freed in the 1917 revolution, upon which she continued as an SR party member, rising up through the ranks, and she represented the SRs at the Brest-Litovsk peace negotiations with Germany in 1918. If we just go to the next slide, you can see General Sakharov there. Okay. And then if we just hop to the next slide, this is Maria Spirodonova. She's probably the most famous terrorist figure from this period in the First Revolution. She's a socialist revolutionary, and she's appalled by how the peasant uprisings in Tambov were being suppressed. The district security chief was Gavril Nikolaevich Luzhinovsky, who we can see in the next slide. He was the leader of the local branch of the reactionary political party, the Union of the Russian People, which was closely linked to extremists in the pro-autocracy group, the Black Hundreds. So when the Tambov socialist revolutionaries passed a death sentence on Luzhinovsky, Spirodonova volunteered to kill him. She surveilled him for several days, and once she'd worked out where he was going to be on a particular day, she, dressed as a secondary school student, approached him and shot and fatally wounded him. She was immediately apprehended on the station platform and beaten there by the crowd. She was tormented and tortured at the local police station, then sexually assaulted or raped by her Cossack guard as she was transported to Tambov. Now, the reason we know this is that Spirodonova wrote a testimony about her ordeal, and when her sister visited her in prison, the sister smuggled out this testimony. It was then published in local, national and international newspapers and caused widespread outrage at Spiridonova's treatment. To the public, it seemed that genteel and principled Spirodonova had suffered brutish attacks from the state. Now, Spirodonova was sentenced to death, but her sentence was commuted to penal servitude for life. And if we go to the next slide, we'll reach the photograph that you saw already. So, in fact, as she was transported into exile on this train, she was accompanied by 5 other women who had been convicted of terrorist crimes, assassination attempts or bomb making, and so on and so forth. The thing was, there was mass public sympathy for these women, for their cause, and even for their methods. And they were feted along the whole Trans-Siberian Railway at every station. And this is where this photograph comes from. You can see that the town has turned out. There's even a child standing at Spiridonova's side. And photographs would be taken, and Spirodonova would speak, and the crowds would cheer them. Even when they arrived at the Kara penal colony, the governor of the prison was there to shake their hands. There were banners, there was singing and music, which goes to show the continued support for the revolutionary movement, even as the 1905 revolution itself was completely crushed. Now, I should point out that the lax prison regime at the Kara penal colony did not last, and things became increasingly stringent. It also seems that Spirodonova suffered from PTSD throughout her incarceration. So we always got to be careful about diagnosing the past, but the various accounts of her seem to suggest that she was still suffering from ongoing trauma. Nonetheless, she survived her exile, was liberated by the 1917 revolution, and went on to lead the left SRs in 1917. Now, if we just move on to the next slide. So there's lots of other women that I would love to talk about with you, and maybe some of you will ask me about them later on after I've finished. So Vera Zasulich, there's Dora Brilliant, Yelena Stasova, Inessa Armand, Nadezhda Krupskaya, who some of you will recognise as Lenin's wife. So many women participated in the movement in all sorts of roles. But it occurred to me that it might be useful to think about how these women revolutionaries had an impact on women in Russia themselves. How did they reach out to women and bring them into the revolutionary movement too? So this is actually a complicated issue. The theory of socialism, and indeed the manifestos of the Socialist Democrats and the Socialist Revolutionaries, all asserted that in a socialist regime there would be no discrimination on the basis of sex. Men and women would be absolutely equal. However, in the revolutionary movement itself in Russia, most men and a good few women were adamant that working women needed no special attention or provisions because their class identity as workers was far more important than their sex. Focusing on women and their own particular needs within the socialist regime was simply lapsing into bourgeois feminism. Now, the woman in the bottom left of this picture, Alexandra Kollontai, argued the opposite. She's almost unique within the women who participated in the revolutionary movement because she was actually a theorist who wrote and published numerous works. The rest were much more activists and organisers. So Alexandra Kollontai looked at the lot of working class women and saw that they faced not just a double burden, but a triple burden in life of economically exploitative employment, of unpaid housework and unpaid childcare. These burdens meant that women had few opportunities either to gain a political education or to participate in the revolutionary movement. As a result, Kollontai argued, revolutionaries had to reach out specifically to women and to spend extra time and effort winning them over to the cause. If revolutionaries didn't do this, there was a chance that the liberal suffragettes who were campaigning in Russia at the same time would win working class support for their movement. Women would be attracted to their promises of access to education, better employment and the vote. But of course, the problem was that suffragettes didn't offer liberation from economic exploitation, and so they didn't want to lose women to the suffragettes. So Kollontai found supporters amongst some women and a few male revolutionaries as well, and succeeded in carving out spaces to work with women specifically. They published newspapers directed specifically at women. They agitated amongst women workers in female-dominated factories in the textile industry, for example. And they adopted and celebrated International Women's Day as a socialist holiday. And this, it must be said, paid off in the long term. So I want now to turn my attention to the revolution that you will all know about, which is, of course, 1917 itself. There are two revolutions, one in February and one in October. Now, the February Revolution was a build-up of deep dissatisfaction with the experience of the war. The Tsar, who was leading the army by this point, was extremely unpopular, was being seen as unsuccessful. Soldiers were suffering dreadfully at the front, and the people of Petrograd, the capital, were also suffering greatly as well. So with high prices, long working hours, fuel shortages, and food shortages as well. So when International Women's Day came along in 1917 on the 23rd of February, that's of course because of the Julian calendar. In the West, it would be the 8th of March, but Russia was behind. So when International Women's Day came along on the 23rd of February, radicalised women in the capital wanted to mark the day. But they were told by their male party bosses not to, that everything must wait until May Day of that year. But these women ignored their bosses and went out to protest, calling for the overthrow of the Tsar. And they didn't just stick to marching for themselves, they went from factory to factory, throwing snowballs and stones at the windows and calling out their male colleagues to join them. And as the days went on, hundreds of thousands of people in Petrograd went out on the streets protesting against the Tsar. Now, one of the key roles that women played in these protests was that they reached out to the soldiers who were deployed around the city to disperse them. They appealed to them as their brothers. We have sent our loved ones off to the war to fight, the women would say. You are soldiers as well. We are one. Don't fire on us. And it worked. On the 27th of February, the soldiers in the cities mutinied and refused to fire on the crowds any longer. At that point, the main generals at the front realised that Nicholas was losing his grip on the country. And if there was mutiny at the front as well, then the war would be lost. So the generals pushed Nicholas II to resign. In the wake of Nicholas II's resignation, a new provisional government was formed, which promised to call elections for a constituent assembly later in the year. However, it was ambivalent about enfranchising women. So thousands of women organised and marched once again, this time on the 8th of March. They were led by liberal suffragettes and revolutionary figures like Vera Fedorov, and they succeeded in ensuring that women were granted the vote. And if we just go to the next slide, you can see the crowds out here calling for votes for women. They're bringing the trams to a standstill. If we go to the next slide, they're saying here there won't be freedom until women have equal rights. And I think there's one more on this one. Yes, women should be represented in the Constituent Assembly. So women were highly active, not only in bringing about the revolution, but then also making sure that the revolution did what they wanted for them and gave them rights. So the provisional government caved on that issue and granted women the rights. They also appointed the first woman cabinet minister ever, Countess Sofia Pirovskaya, who's on the next slide, to the post of Deputy Minister of Education. Now, in the months that followed, women across the country took advantage of the revolutionary regime to express their own demands for the new government. All the all the revolutionary parties, including the Bolsheviks, made sure that women were co-opted onto their central committees. And Bolshevik women revived the women's newspaper, Rabotnitsa, which we can see on the next page, to target women specifically, to keep them in support of the revolution. You can see on the bottom left here, Alexandra Kollontai with the necklace on the left bottom, and then just above her, with her face in her hands, that's Anna Ulyanova, that's Lenin's sister. In April, an All-Russian Congress of Women was held in Moscow, while in Kazan, the All-Russian Congress of Muslim Women took place. And if we go to the next slide, we can see that. And it gives you a sense of the way in which revolutionary agitation had reached all the corners of the Russian Empire. At this Congress, women raised issues of equality between men and women, the abolition of polygamy and bride price, women's right to divorce, and other social problems. Another group that was highly active in the revolutionary year of 1917 were soldiers' wives. If we just go to the next slide, you can see them here. So, as I said, soldiers' wives were active in the February days themselves, but they were also had a sort of continuing awareness of their worth to the state. And this is them marching, asking that they get more state support so that they can feed their children and get better state support while their husbands and brothers and fathers are away fighting at the front. If we go to the next page, I think there's another slide. Yes, there's another: increased state support for soldiers' families. So organised and radicalised. Now, in April 1917, the provisional government experienced its first crisis, in fact. In February, the provisional government had been formed, but also a workers' council, a Soviet, had also been formed. They're so-called the sort of dual powers, the dual authorities in Petrograd. And when the provisional government had its first crisis, lots of women and men took to the streets to call for the overthrow of the provisional government and for the Soviet to take power. And if we go to the next slide, we can see, yes, long live the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers Deputies. And then on the next slide again, we can see power to the Soviet and down with the capitalist ministers. So I think the key thing here is to notice the way that women remained active and informed throughout 1917. Quite often the history books mention women on the 23rd of February and then forget all about them, but women continued to be engaged. In May, 40,000 laundresses went on strike over pay and conditions, organised by the Bolshevik woman Goncharskaya, and the strike was successful. And in August, women were part of the defence of the city when the commander-in-chief, Kornilov, marched on the capital intending to stage a coup d'etat, but he was repelled. Of course, as you know, the story ends, well, for this for this talk anyway, in October 1917, when the Bolsheviks seized power. And in the days when, as the Bolsheviks steadily and systematically took over the city and all the major institutions, women were on hand providing medical support, keeping the trams running and maintaining communications. Alexandra Kollontai, who I spoke about earlier, was appointed the first woman commissar in the Soviet government as Commissar of Public Welfare. And we can see her on the next slide. There she is in her office. Children's welfare obviously falling under her remit. And then if we go to the next slide after that, yes, you can see her here. So this is a shot of the first Bolshevik government. You can see Lenin in the middle there. Kollontai is on his left, and to Kollontai's left is another woman. That's Yelena Stasova, who was the first secretary of the the Bolshevik Party in the new regime. So the sort of final part of that year of 1917 was the elections to the Constituent Assembly, which the Provisional Government had promised. It was Russia's first and only universal democratic elections under the Soviet regime. And not only did women vote in huge numbers, but women appeared on the ballot papers as well. So Alexandra Kollontai, Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, Maria Ulyanova, Lenin's sister, were all on the Bolshevik ticket. Brezhkovskaya, Spirodonova and Figner all appeared on the SR lists. The Bolsheviks, in fact, shut down the newly elected Constituent Assembly after it's only for one day and ruled as a single party for the next 90 years. Whether the new Bolshevik government delivered on its promises of emancipating women is a story for another time. But there's no denying, as hopefully you'll have seen, the very real and significant contribution women made to the overthrow of the Tsar. And my final slide, I just thought I would put up a picture of my novel, Blackbird Song, which, as I said, features briefly Anastasio Bitsenko, the terrorist, and follows the lives of 3 revolutionary students in the 1905 revolution as they try and deal with these questions of whether committing terrorism is justified and what price will have to be paid for committing violence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie, for such an engaging and fascinating talk. As I said in my introduction, I hadn't heard, apologies, for the 1905 revolution. It's been really, really interesting, not to just hear about it, but hear about such strong and interesting women that were there. Now we've got time for some questions, and I'm joined by my colleague Beth Cochrane to help me with the Q&A session. And I think, Beth, you have the first question.
I do, yeah. Thank you so much, Katie. That was really interesting. It makes me want to go and march or something now. Yeah, so I think we've got a few questions from our audience as well, but I'd really like to kick us off with one, if that's all right. Yeah. So I'm wondering, how well represented are women in the histories of the Russian Revolution?
Well, it's kind of it's a sort of two-part picture, if you like. So women historians like myself and lots of people who went before me have researched and written about women's involvement in the Russian Revolution for probably about 60 years now. And there's a huge body of work that's available about what women did. What's unfortunate and a perennial problem is that body of work hasn't really been integrated into the general histories of the Russian Revolution. So as I hinted in my talk, what tends to happen in stories of 1917 is that historians quite rightly acknowledge women's role on International Women's Day, the 23rd of February, but then very quickly stop talking about all the other things women were doing for the rest of the year and concentrate on the ministers of the government and so on, and sort of eclipse women by talking about just the masses or the peasants or the workers, and cease to see the very specific and important contribution women made. So,
thank you. Kenny, would you like to someone from the audience?
Yeah, I will go to the floor, and it's quite a wide floor when I'm looking at it here, because Catherine Lavender. Catherine, thanks for joining us. Catherine says, not a question, but these online events allow us far, far away to attend. She's in New York City.
Oh, wow.
Thanks so much for joining us from there.
Yes.
I'll go to a question from Elizabeth. Elizabeth asks, can you say a bit about women's education and the position of women in Russia in general at this time?
Yes, well, Russia was actually, Tsarist Russia actually compared quite well with the West in terms of educational rights. So Alexander, the irony of the revolutionaries going after Alexander II is that he in fact was the great reformer. He emancipated the serfs, he opened up the universities, he also oversaw a real expansion of education. So by the time people like Lenin's sister is a teenager, she quite happily gets a primary and secondary education, and although she can't quite attend university, she can go to what were called the higher women's courses, which were university equivalents. And she could qualify as a doctor and as a teacher and go off and find some professions open to her. So not a bad picture, and certainly compares with, say, Britain, where the universities were only just opening up to women. Obviously, once the Bolsheviks come into power, they immediately equalise educational provision and expand it enormously. And so there's a real transformation there of especially trying to tackle illiteracy in the peasant communities, especially amongst women. So the only slightly sour note, of course, is that the education that was offered was highly censored, and Lenin's wife Krupskaya was involved in making sure that the curriculum supported the socialist regime. So again, not quite the universal education under the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. Beth, over to you for the next question.
Yes, I think I will go for Sandy McDonald. Hello, Sandy. Sandy says, apologies for missing the beginning. It's quite all right, don't worry about it. And do these women get acknowledged in Russia, even if we don't hear about them in the UK?
Well, certainly the Bolsheviks, as lots of you will know, dealt very swiftly with other left-wing revolutionary parties, but always had a bit of a blind spot for the women terrorists of that period, because they recognised their fame and their sort of cultural importance. So lots of them got statues around Russia, for example. Lots of them were encouraged to write their memoirs, which is why we know so much about them, because they all wrote about their lives later on. Lots of them escaped Stalin's purges as well. So in that respect, they remained present, even as they were sort of increasingly on the fringes. These days, of course, the way the Russian regime is at the moment, they don't want to promote any kind of terrorism. So they're sort of being lost in the history pages. But certainly under the Soviet regime itself, they had a long presence.
Excellent, thank you. Kenny, would you like to choose our next question?
Yeah, Ella asked this question quite early on, and I think she's on, I've written Sofia Pirovskaya's. She's asking how old was Sofia, and if I remember rightly, so Sofia must have had the worst prison guards that were ever.
Yes.
Anyway,
now I'm afraid off the top of my head, I don't actually know her age, but they were all in their 20s. They were all extremely young. People joined the movement straight out of school, almost at the age of 16, and in particular, the going to the people's movement was very much almost sort of a teenage affair. You know, all these idealist youths going off out into the countryside. So yes, tragically young, I suppose you would say, of Sofia Pirovskaya. Yeah.
Beth, next question from you.
We have them flooding in, I must say. You have a very engaged audience. Okay, so from Romy, and the question is, did the election for the Constituency Congress take place? When and who in particular shut it down?
So yes, so the Bolsheviks absolutely didn't want to hold these elections, but it was a fundamental promise of the provisional government and had massive public support, or so they believed. So the elections were carried out over November of 1917. And the Constituent Assembly met on the 5th of January 1918. But what, of course, happened was that the Bolsheviks did not get a majority. The socialist revolutionaries swept the board, basically, and had over 40% of the seats. So the Bolsheviks couldn't allow this to stand because they still wanted to be in charge. So they basically had their inaugural session, and then the Bolsheviks sent the army to surround the Constituent Assembly and shut it down and close it. Now, the real shock, though, at that point, for so many people who were hoping for a democratic resolution to the revolution, there was no mass outcry at this point. People didn't take to the streets again to protest about the Constituent Assembly being shut down, and that was it. It was gone in one day, and the Bolsheviks were supreme. So,
wow, it's quick work, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Kenny, would you like to choose our next question?
I don't think anybody realises how difficult this is when there's so many questions coming in, but it's great that everybody's engaging with us. And one person who's engaged with us is Kavya, who logged in from India to learn about that. So we're definitely. What did we ever do without Zoom? I really don't know. She'd love to buy a copy of the book. And Kavya, what I'll say is we are sending out a link at the end of this webinar that will have a link directly to the book, so you can order it online from there. And the next question that I did have up, and there's so many. Okay, it's from Diane. And Diane says, that was fascinating, Katy. Still so far to go to achieve equality. Does it frustrate you that International Women's Day has been cut adrift from its revolutionary roots? Great question.
Yes, it's really fascinating the way that it was initially a socialist holiday, and but you're right, it has. There's always that danger, isn't it? The historical memory isn't that long necessarily, and before you know it, the real roots of it have disappeared, and no more so than in Russia itself. So it's still a huge day in Russia, but it's sort of become more like a Valentine's Day, as it were. So the men are supposed to take over the housework for the day. They're supposed to bring their wives and girlfriends and mothers flowers and give them a nice, kind day. But of course, it causes as much sort of joking as anything else, because of course the women all joke that, you know, if only they did it for the rest of the time as well, and so on. So yes, it's hard to see something, especially in Russia, something that was so serious and important become this sort of confection box holiday now.
Lovely. I'm going to go. Oh, sorry, Kenny. I'm just diving right in here with a question from Michael. And Michael asks if women were occupying economic roles which had been vacated by men at the front, and if so, did this increase their radicalisation? Interesting question, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent one. Yes, yeah, no, he's absolutely spot on. I mean, there had been a strong presence of women in in factories and so on in Russia for about 25 years by this point. But yes, there was an upsurge similar to the one you see in the West as well. So women going into munitions factories and so on. Yes, and so you do have this sort of confluence of factors where, on the one hand, women are in the factories serving their nation and aware of their value in that way. But the identity of people as soldiers' wives, the soldatka, that's what they call themselves, the soldatka, the soldiers' wives. This sort of was an extra layer of radicalism where they were actually entitled to support from the state, but it was woefully low, and so. And still they were having to queue for bread, and still they were having to work 14 hours a day. So yes, this definitely causes this kind of perfect storm of radicalisation. There's a secret police report from December 1916, which says explicitly that there's more chance of revolution beginning in the bread queues amongst the women than there is from people like Milyukov and other radicals, the male radicals of the time.
Excellent. I'd love to see that. Yeah. Radicals in Tesco.
Lovely. People are still in the room, so to speak, so we'll continue with the Q&A if that's okay with you, Katy.
Absolutely, yes, yeah.
One about your new book, which has just been released, I think, if I'm
that's right, yeah.
End of April. It's from Catherine. She says, can you speak about the reasons to tell the story as a novel as opposed to history?
I suppose for me, it was about telling the story to a slightly different audience. I mean, for the last 20 years, I've been speaking at academic conferences about women's role in the Russian Revolution, and chipping away at the sort of the ignoring of women in the sort of academic context. But it's nice to think that by writing a novel, I'll perhaps get their story out to people who won't encounter these stories in any other way. I suppose the other thing is that they're just such interesting women. They're strong, they've got agency, they take charge of their political destiny, and a novel gives you the chance to really explore their entire lives. Not just the stuff academics would talk about, their politics, but their emotional lives, their families, the end of their life, and so on as well. It just makes it a much more rich picture, I think.
Lovely, thanks, Katy. Beth.
Yeah, I can see Netflix getting in touch with you, Katy. This could be an excellent series, very bingeable. So my next question is going to come from Andrea, who asks, how did these women manage to escape Stalin's purges? Did they flee into exile?
There were remarkably few of these women actually ended up in exile. Some were expelled by Lenin deliberately and sent out of the country under his leadership. By the time we get to Stalin's purges, lots of these terrorist women are in their later years, let's put it that way, and so less of a perceived threat than others. Some have made compromises with their principles and sort of ceased to resist the regime in any way, and so are allowed to kind of live out quiet lives in their own little flats in Moscow and things like that. But some don't. So some women, in fact, end up in prison, seen as spies, and will be shot in the 1940s. When the very last purges of the sort of the old guard are dealt with. So Spirodonova, for example, will ends her life in prisons and is shot. But in the main, they just have to live these compromised, quiet lives.
Thank you. That was a great answer.
Next up, as I say, people are still here, so I'm going to try and get through as many questions as we can. Next one's from Alistair Hart. I think, Alistair, you want to ask two questions, but I think Katy's just answered the second of your questions. But the first part is, do you know any women from outside Russia, for example, British women, if they were involved in the movements you mentioned?
So there was an international socialist scene. So you were thinking about people like Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg, who were active in Germany. There are even links with American socialist women. The one that might surprise people, the British link, Sylvia Pankhurst was much more left-wing than her suffragettes mother and sister, and in fact visited Soviet Russia on several occasions and sort of kept ties that way. So yes, there were women across the whole of the West, as we would know it, participating in this network of women.
We've got time for two more questions before the end of the webinar. So Beth, I will ask you to ask the penultimate question.
It's a lot of pressure here. Don't know if I can handle it.
You managed your first Zoom webinar just now, so anything's easy.
I'm feeling very pleased. It's been a pleasure.
Okay. I hope everybody out there realises this was Beth's first webinar, so I'm so pleased for you, Beth. It's gone so well.
It's done very well.
Well, I have a question from Hilary, and her question is a follow-up on the closure of the elected body. Why do you think there was no public outcry about it being shut down after the huge appetite for the elections to establish it?
I think on the one hand, you've got to remember that the country has already gone through 3 years of war. They've also had a year of revolutionary upheaval and turmoil. And also there's actually quite deep discontent with the remnants of the bourgeois sort of provisional government. So it's partly tarnished by its connection to the provisional government itself. It was seen as part of their remit and they've been overthrown. So I think there is all of that. There is, of course, there's a brief sort of hiatus, and then, of course, there is the civil war. So the democratic forces do regroup, the socialist revolutionaries do regroup and begin to fight back against the Bolsheviks, and there will be civil war for the next 3 years after that. But I think just in that moment when this Constituent Assembly is shut down, I think perhaps everyone just, the city is exhausted, and they just don't have the energy for yet another fight. As I say, and it will come later.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Katie, for answering my side of the questions. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And
there's some lovely messages coming in to both of you of well done, Beth, from Susan, and thank you, Kate, for fascinating and engaging presentations. So I think I will leave it at that with the congratulations to both of you. As I say, I now need to wrap this webinar up, but my thanks again, Katie. It's been a joy to have you with us at the not at the National Library as such, in my sitting room, in Beth's sitting room, etc., and everybody else's sitting room around the world. Thanks to you, Beth, for all your support that's given us to make this webinar happen. Just to say that, as I said earlier, we'll be sending a link for Katie's book with our feedback form, and hope you get to take the opportunity to order what I think will be a fascinating book. That's all from us this week, but we will be back in June with some cracking webinars. So have a look on our website, and as I said earlier, hopefully you'll be able to join us for those.
Thanks very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay, thanks, Katie. Finally, on behalf of the National Library of Scotland, thank you everyone who's joined us from all over the world. It's been just over a year since our library webinar started, and we have come a long way together. But I think we might be heading to a good place. Fingers crossed anyway. But as always, stay safe, be kind to yourself, and bye for now.
Bye.